some commonalities between vendors and researchers, and then there's some significant difference of opinion. So part of what it boils down to my mind, is asymmetry. Right now in the software community especially, it's actually easier to find problems than to fix them. And in fact, you could argue that the reason that they're easier to find is because the software development practices of the vendor are poor. Okay, so that's one argument to be made. The other argument to be made is that the forces of economic pressure cause vendors to release product before they're tested to the nth degree. And so therefore, the whole reason the vendor exists is because they get to market first. And that asymmetry means that they'll push the testing cycles down, potentially slower. And the third would be that the asymmetry is customers aren't buying security. They're actually buying something else, and if it happens to have security or something like it in it, that's great, but that's not in fact what the economic cycle is that's being purchased. So the research community and the vendors, I can tell you for sure, do not want a malicious and nasty exploitation to occur. So we've got that in common. The second thing, interestingly enough, that we're starting to get in common, where the vendors always had it and the research community had differing versions of it, is we both like to make money. And unfortunately, what that's now turning is to things like, to David's point, bounty, sort of bug bounties. I don't pay my employees to find bugs and give them bounties. So I guess I'm finding it a little puzzling as to why I'd start spending money for other people to find bugs in my product. On the other hand, I think there is a reward factor to be had, which is called appreciation. That's a much different element. So instead of bug bounties, it's thanks. Thanks, on the other hand, I'm very willing to go to the mat for. I very much appreciate the work that you've done, essentially voluntarily, and I am willing to go at small to large lengths. And interestingly enough, it's highly subjective as to what an individual that we talked to that found something would like. In some cases, they actually do just want the thank you. Just a simple note of appreciation and disclosure that I found it. Copy that. Come to find out, the reason that is oftentimes useful was actually pointed out in the executive forum yesterday, which is finding a bug and building a reputation of finding bugs actually builds your business. So the acknowledgement that a vendor says, good job, greatly appreciate it, actually helps the research community profitably. Last point, David. But then the other element could be, I would actually like money, I would like a router, I would like free access to software so I can do more research, whatever it is that essentially is very low cost to a vendor, is the other spectrum of this. And I think that is thanks. That's very different. Because bountying essentially says, I really, really, really want you to find a ton of it. Thanks is just a simple acknowledgement that you didn't have to help me, and you did, and I think it's considered the politeness of the game. Last piece of this, responsible disclosure is a dead phrase. It probably was the dumbest phrase anyway, because it almost suggests that everybody else is being irresponsible on every other activity, and it's like a best practice. Everybody's version was responsible, and therefore everybody else's was irresponsible. I think what we've just got to get to is a point where you know how the vendor handles bugs, handles their disclosure, and then hold them accountable to it. Thanks.
Yeah. So the thanks definitely worked. I would have said about 5 or 6 years ago, especially when some of these researchers were beginning to make their name in the industry, but now they've been here. Actually, let's not even say 5, 6 years. Let's say 10 years. They've been getting thanks for the past 10 years. They've got well-established reputations in the industry. The thanks for these guys, I guess, is wearing a bit thin, and so they don't need to build reputation because they've got one of the best reputations out there. And at the end of the day, they feel obviously that you do incentivize your employees. You said you don't give them bonuses and stuff like that at work. Well, you do. You pay them a wage and so on. So there is that incentivization, and no doubt there's Christmas bonuses as well, I guess, or whatever, So I guess people like Mozilla and Google have turned around and said, if we formalize it, if we say, if you come to us with a really decent bug, we will incentivize you for that. We will give you, I think Mozilla's paying $3,000 at the moment, and Google have upped theirs to 31337 or something like that. It's got that whole lead speak in it and stuff. But rather than having a researcher come up to them and say, look, I found this really cool bug, unless you play ball with me and pay me $3,000, I'm going to unleash it, and then you're going to have hell to pay. if they formalize it, then there's an expectation there, and those expectations are much better managed than someone necessarily coming towards the vendor and saying, got this really cool stuff, unless you pay ball, I'm just going to unleash this, and then there's going to be all this client exploitation kind of, and it sort of gets it out of the gutter. And I don't like to say it, but it's almost like when you're at a you pull up at some traffic lights, and you've got a dirty windscreen, and someone comes along and cleans it for you. You didn't ask for that to be cleaned and everything like that, but the fact is you've now got a clean windscreen. You do pay the guy $1, you know what I mean? So he can go and feed whoever he needs to feed at home. So just throwing out a different twist in that regard.
Yeah, and I have to agree with David about the bug bounty. Thanks doesn't pay the mortgage, and our industry has grown up, and a lot of these researchers have kids, and they'd like them to have a backyard. And the other fact is, what's changed the last 5 years is now there's so many options for a researcher to sell their bugs that they're no longer, 5, 6 years ago it was, okay, well maybe I'll find some sketchy guy on IRC and sell it to him, or I report it to John and he gives me thanks. And now the option is I can sell it to ZDI, I can sell it to this, I know my friend who knows a guy at DoD and I can sell it to DoD. The other thing I want to make clear is that bugs don't sell anymore, exploits sell. Right? The proliferation and the success of anti-exploit technologies has made it so people have to go to great lengths to write, reliable exploits, people doing return-oriented programming, all the weird, crazy heap spraying stuff, Flash JIT, Java JIT, and because of that, finding bugs is still actually a pretty easy process. Anybody with a free fuzzer can go find bugs in most commercial software, but making that a reliable exploit is a skill set that is much more valuable now. And I think we're seeing now a differentiation in the value of an exploit versus the value of a bug, since most of the people who are buying this don't have the exploit creation teams that are as good. And so I think we're going to continue to see the most interesting research isn't going to be research into finding bugs. It's going to be the research that like Mark Dowd has done and that Dino has done into creating new exploit technologies that get around the anti-exploit stuff like ASLR and NX and stuff and things like that.
Okay, so you guys are beating me up about the word thanks. I did actually indicate there is capitalization in that thanks just as much as words. So, don't lose track of that. And we got the question. So a comment about that. So the research community didn't used to be about for profit. And I think that the situation we're talking about now is it is turning itself into one that has a potential for profit.
I think it's been that way for a couple of years now, unfortunately.
Right. No, I'm not saying it's happened this morning, but it definitely has changed. So, it's entirely possible that might be part of the reason we're having the meeting or this panel discussion this year is because the client of the research is no longer uniquely the vendor. And that may in and of itself make a situation where the vendor could become the last person or last company to know about an exploit because in fact the research community can sell to a higher bidder. I guess that's the buyer beware scenario, which is we're going to get into a bidding war. I suspect, by the way, that I couldn't outbid the three-letter agencies we're talking about because I've seen the budgets.
Or you haven't.
Oh yeah, right. Or I've seen the published budgets.
Yeah.
But I would suggest that simply that if that's where it's going, then I think the change of what the original goal that Bill brought up, which is we're trying to make the internet better, may in fact have already bifurcated to a different purpose, which is as a researcher, I'm trying to become profitable. I don't know that I consider that great news.
There's no charities represented on this stage up here, right? And I hate I know I'm just playing devil's advocate here, right? Since we got to represent our brothers, right? And but it has been for a long time the desire for security researchers to work for pennies and for thanks and to live in their mom's basement when they're dealing with Fortune 100 companies with $50 billion capitalizations, I think is incredibly hypocritical. And I don't begrudge. We don't sell exploits, we don't make exploits, we don't do any of that kind of stuff. That's not our business. But for the people that do, that is a valid business, and I don't like the idea of calling them evil because they want to make money for having an incredibly valuable skill that is very rare. That they're at least Dino is doing it publicly. Like if Dino lived in an ex-Soviet country, you would never hear about him, but the guy would drive a Mercedes for sure, right?
Okay, so we have this also in common, which as soon as money gets involved on either side of the research community or the vendor community, bad things can happen. So that's what it comes down to. I absolutely agree that the research community shouldn't be quote unquote exploited specifically for the fact that the work is being done and we've got $50 billion capitalizations. That's why I said the word thanks is important, not because it's the word, but because the individual that actually does the work, because they're not a full-time employee, which I actually have a structured way by which I know they're going to be rewarded, actually can determine what they believe the best reward for them is. And it turns out, I think some of the communities decide that profit is actually part of the best reward.
Yeah, so I'm watching this tennis match going back and forth. It's kind of fun. I actually kind of fall in between both positions here because, I come from a culture in the Department of Defense where we give out medals, and we have people that are making, $25,000 a year out there getting killed every single day, and they fight just to get a medal on their chest. And so I kind of lean towards John's position to some degree that, thanks or recognition is worth a hell of a lot. And I think, what I find somewhat frustrating, and I like it when we go to an RSA conference, and it may sound a little corny, but when you recognize some of the leaders, unfortunately, we recognize the leaders that are sort of graybeards. And we don't recognize the real folks that are out there making the difference in the community. And, in the military, in most cases, the medals are going to those troops that are on the ground, putting their lives at risk, or in some cases, even researchers who are coming up with phenomenal new technologies, like coming up with a new Kelvar vest or a new, armor plating capability for a Humvee or whatever. And I think in this community, if we can get to that point where we have Jeff standing up there like this morning and spends the first 25 minutes, not putting, a keynoter up there, which is, I think, important to have that strategic discussion, but actually spending a good chunk of time recognizing people, recognizing the researchers, recognizing people that have made an operational difference. I think we can get closer to John's vision of maybe creating a community of practice that people will want to make this place a lot safer without having been paid $3,000 or $5,000. But on the other hand, I do agree you don't want to exploit them. And there's a lot of money to be had out there, a ton of money to be had out there, and we need to figure out a way to put that money in places where people can take advantage of it. Look at the Nobel Peace Prize, or all the Nobel prizes that are given out. What is it, $100,000?
$1 million.
Is it $1 million now? There's no reason, why Microsoft and Cisco and all these big boys can't throw a bunch of money in the pot, including the government, and say we're going to give the Nobel, Internet Security Prize of the year to this person, and by the way, we're going to have 15 runner-ups, and they're going to get, $100,000 a pop or whatever. And I think if you start in that direction, you can get a little closer to John's vision. So that's my 2 cents.
Sort of the Vern Cerf Award for outstanding security leadership or something like that. Interesting. So,
just a quick thing was,
Yep.
I don't think, like I said before, buying exploits isn't making anybody more secure. It's like a needle exchange program, right? Needle exchange doesn't get people to stop doing drugs. It keeps them from getting AIDS, right? And I think that's what buying exploits on the market is that you're not making your software better. You're just getting those infected needles off the street.
okay, we did have an audience question. Sorry, you have to stand up and yell because we.
Apologies because I'm British and I may well have
Yeah.
nature of this talk session, but I interpreted it as it was collaboration between CSO, which is in my language is Chief Security Officers and consumers of that sort of products and the research community. And I'm just very interested in Hannah's view on exactly how, like myself as a consumer of security services, can actually work more collaboratively